Just switch it on. So if you need to adjust mics, do it. You've got that one there. Just the stand. Don't try not to touch the mic.
Okay.
But at the moment, the sound is into the yellow.
Yep. Okay. Good.
Ready?
Ready. O Heavenly King, comforter, Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fills all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls, O good one.
Okay, good evening everybody, and welcome to the next in our fortnightly series of talks. Broadly, the series is titled The Introduction to Orthodox Christianity. The first talk, in which Father Nick every fortnight gives us a small lecture, and most fortnights we also have a guest speaker. Last week we didn't have one, but this week we're welcoming back Dr. Helen. So the first talk that we had in this series was titled The Meeting. The second touched upon the Bible and tradition within the Bible. The third, which was a fortnight ago, Father Nicholas talked about the connection between the Old and the New Testament. It was quite an in-depth talk. This week, Father Nick's talk is titled The Song of Love. And correspondingly, Dr. Helen will be, her talk is titled Love in Human Relations, the Carrot and the Stick. If I can remind you, it's going to be interesting. If I can remind you to send in comments, please, and questions. You can either write your comments in the YouTube comment section, or you can send them by text anonymously to the phone number that will magically appear in your screen soon. And with that, I shall hand you over to Father Nicholas.
Thank you, Andre. All right. So tonight we begin talking about the gospel, and I've called it the Song of Love. Why call it a song? Well, we're doing a series which I've called Introduction to Orthodox Christianity, and I've always used this model or this image when explaining what the word orthodoxy means. I would use, because I've had a lot to do with music in my younger days, and I still love music in various ways. I have spoken of orthodoxy by, and you'll pick it up, I like to listen to words and their meaning, their etymology. And yes, orthodoxy has two roots in it. The first part, orthos, means right, correct, and doxa is a Greek word which means glory. So it's the right glory or glorification or the correct worship. That's what the word orthodoxy means. And how do we worship God? Well, some of the Anglican theologians have called the Orthodox Church the singing church, which I find a very nice description. And so I've referred to orthodoxy as singing in tune with heaven. You've got to be right on the note. You can't be quarter tone off. Sounds awful. All right. So that's the song. So what does the word gospel mean? Well, it's an Old English word. It's a Germanic word, and it's in original form. It's actually Godspell, Godspell, Godspell. God in Old English, in Anglo-Saxon, means good. So, in a lot of some languages, some language groups, the word for God and good come from the same origin. In the Slavic languages, it is so, and also in the Germanic languages, God and good. Okay. So literally it means good, that's the first root, and spell meant news or tidings. So it's a translation of the Greek word evangelion, which means good news. Okay. So, we spoke about the Old Testament as a way of looking forward to the coming of Christ, the central event of human history. So, that was the story of God's unfolding economy. I've mentioned that word, and that word means God's plan of our for humanity, God's plan of salvation. So the gospel, good news, is that the Word becomes flesh. God comes to us. The Son of God is born. And it's really good news that God is love, as the evangelist of love, St. John, tells us in his first letter. So, this whole story, how Christ is born, grows until the age of 30, and then comes to the River Jordan, begins his ministry for roughly 3.5 years, and then goes through his suffering, his passion, death, and resurrection. So the image of Christ on the cross is the most powerful image, Christian image, of God's love, because there are it's a many-faceted image. And one of the facets of this is that visually, Christ's outstretched arms on the cross speak of God's invitation to come to Him. Open arms. We can respond to that. There's many other components to that, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Now, hopefully my section will take about 35 minutes. I hope that'll be enough time for me. Right. The other part of the good news is about God's forgiveness. Forgiveness is a major theme, major topic of the gospel, of the good news. And when Christ sends his disciples to preach to the world, he tells them to preach about God's forgiveness to humanity. Okay? Forgiveness is such an important aspect of the gospel message. When you think about it, the Lord's Prayer, something so central in Christian life, a prayer that is a model for all other prayers, if you like, given by Christ to his disciples when they asked him to teach them how to pray. And he gave them the Lord's Prayer: Our Father, Now, in that prayer, it has the phrase, and forgive us our debts, literally, as we forgive our debtors. Or in the older English form, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. It's basically an interpretation of the literal word. Right. Christ, in his teaching about forgiveness, goes as far as talking about loving our enemies. And this is the part of the teaching of his Sermon on the Mount. It says, what thank have ye? What gratitude do you expect when you love those who love you, who do good things to you? But if you want to be the children of God, what you've got to do is do what God does, because He's like the sun that shines on everybody equally. And so this is a major theme in the gospel, that He wants His people, the people of God, to be initiators of love, loving kindness, forgiveness, a love of enemies. Concerning love of enemies, which is completely impossible from a human point of view, it can only be achieved through the gift of God's grace, which is the power of God's love. And might I add here that love itself is not something that we can generate out of our being. Mind you, our being itself is given to us by God. And all the more, love is a gift of God. Love as Christianity understands, as Christ wants us to understand it. I mean, oh yes, human beings have many ideas about love, what love is, but most of them fall short of what Christ is talking about. Take, for instance, a 6th century saint, St. Isaac the Syrian, who, and I should add that the patristic tradition, the tradition of the Holy Fathers, is really a continuation of the gospel. It's a living gospel. The gospel is not a document that can be contained between two covers. It's not a codex of law that we refer to. It's a living thing, the Word of God. It's a living Word, right? And so it lives on, and it speaks in addition to the established text of the gospel. There are many echoes of the gospel in the creations, in the works of patristic writers. And so this Isaac the Syrian, he says, a struggler who reaches a point of, in his growth, in repentance and humility, that he is filled with such love, he or she, of course, that we begin to love not only nice people, but even bad people. We begin to love animals, beasts, and he says, a person like that, who is filled with the grace of God, has compassion even on the demons because they are suffering. Right? Now, Saint Silouan, a 20th century saint of Mount Athos. He died in 1938. In his book, written by his words written down by his disciple, the future Archimandrite Sophronius Sakharov. Saint Cyril once says, the distinctive mark of the Christian is that he or she loves enemies. If you don't have that spirit in you, you're not a Christian yet. So that's Saint Cyril. All right. The Lord himself said powerful things about love in the course of his 3.5 years ministry, and especially at the Last Supper, the mystical supper as the Orthodox refer to it. In chapter 13, he talks about a new commandment that he gives to them, to love one another. And he adds that all will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. This is a distinguishing mark of Christians, to have love, to have love between each other, and even to the point of loving enemies. Further, in the long conversation during the Last Supper, the mystical supper, Christ says that there is no greater love than to lay down your life for your friends. These are just some of the most powerful sayings of the Lord. But even without saying things, he speaks to us with his whole life. Now, think about it. The gospel, a composite picture in 4 parts, and God willing, we'll talk about that next time, about the composite picture. Well, it presents to us Christ as a teacher who teaches not only with his words and with his deeds, but even in total silence, he still teaches. Right? And that's interesting. But from the moment of his birth, he begins to teach. Look what sort of a thought he begins to communicate in his birth in Bethlehem. The King of Kings, where is he born? He's born in a stable. He's placed in a box used a feedlot, used for sheep and cattle, called manger. The words manger and creche are French words that refer to the box that is used, it is filled with whatever is given to the cattle. And they've come to signify, in various languages, places connected with babies and small children through Christ. Now, Christ teaches us in this humble birth that what he wants to do is to share the pain of humanity. He didn't have to do it because he is born according to the ancient patristic theology of the church, that he is born with a human nature that is like ours but different to ours, because as St. Paul writes that he came in the likeness of the body of sin. He wanted to be like us, but he is not. His body is different. His whole human nature is different. That there's a very involved teaching, the Christian anthropology about the sort of humanity that Christ had. But he wanted to experience all the pain, all the restrictions, all the constraints of our fallen state, including, last of all, death. He connects with his sinless nature, which was like the nature of Adam before the fall. With his love, he connects to us, to our state. It's not that he does it every time, because that would be a little bit artificial, but he does it constantly. As if he's one of us in everything. So that is the ultimate projection and experience and message that comes from his love to us. And the ultimate connection to our anguish happens in his prayer in Gethsemane, when he prays and says and asks if it's possible, may this cup bypass him, as if he is one of us, even though he knows from before the beginning of the ages that this is what he has to do. And he teaches us that we should seek not our will, but as he says in the Lord's Prayer, let your will be done, Father. So, love, the way Christ understands it, is vastly different to how we human beings understand it. Because our love is almost always possessive. We want either to possess or to consume with our love. And this explains even, the cute expression how we talk about babies, I love to eat you. There's something existential there, because our love does consume. It wants to eat. And the Holy Father, yes, it might seem funny, but you know what? The Holy Father basically explained to us that from the moment that hand stretched to the forbidden fruit, we have become consumers. Consume everything, and everyone. In our relationships, we want to consume people, we want to possess people, we want to swallow them, control them. The love of Christ is always a life-giving force that gives freedom for the other person to develop and grow. So, in everything, Christ is the model. If you want to understand what love is, keep reading the Gospel over and over and over again. I think I've spoken about the lectionary, the readings that are given to the church for every day of the year. And so we read the Bible, we read the Gospel, read the rest of the New Testament. And we learn from Christ. He is the Good Samaritan. And when that Pharisee asked him, "And who is my neighbor? Who is the person that is worthy of my love?" Christ gives that parable as the answer. And he mentions in the story how two people walked past the man who was beaten up and lying half dead. And the third one, the Samaritan, he chose that name intentionally because the Pharisees despised him and gave him that name, Samaritan, because they hated and despised Samaritans, who were considered sort of semi-pagan. They didn't know the law properly. And Galilee was north of Samaria, on the other side of Samaria, from Judea. All right. Yes, so Christ asks the Pharisee after telling the story, the parable, who out of these three people was a neighbor to the person who had fallen into this trouble? Now, the Pharisee couldn't get his mouth around saying that it was a Samaritan. He said, the one who showed him mercy. And so he said, go and do likewise. So this is the commandment. Christ is saying to us, imitate me, do what I do. And if you want to read interpretations of the Holy Fathers about this beautiful parable, well, this parable talks about the entire economy of God. Talks about the whole story of Christ and the church in our salvation. But I obviously can't talk about it now. Now, Jesus Christ is the Savior, and this is the central part of the economy, that it is the economy of salvation. But he's also a teacher, and in the gospel story he is constantly referred to and addressed as a teacher. So, what does he teach? Well, he teaches us, among other things, a progression of three very important things: patience, humility, and love. You see, there's a progression, as I said there. Patience, well, we have the Old Testament image of Job, an ancient story of the innocent sufferer. It's one of the Old Testament books of religious philosophy, the problem of suffering of innocent people. It's a serious problem. And in the Orthodox Church lectionary, parts of this story are read in Holy Week and Passion Week before Easter, because Job is an archetype of Christ himself, the innocent sufferer, the one who shows Job infinite patience. Even though he's treated so badly, Christ puts up with these attacks, with human baseness, with disgraceful behavior of human beings. And only on one occasion, at the foot of the mountain of transfiguration, as he walks down and encounters an ugly scene there, he cries out, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long will I suffer you? He needed to communicate things sometimes even with anger. But this is even in his anger, he's still loving. His anger is not destructive, it is constructive. Right. Well, humility, I've already said about his birth in Bethlehem and the rest of his story. Look, in the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about if you have two coats, give one away to the person who doesn't have one. And you know what? He only had one. He only had one coat. This is why when it came to crucifixion, the time of his crucifixion, they drew lots who would take his coat. Also in Holy Week and Passion Week, the church brings out an icon which is called extreme humility. It's an image of Christ with hands tied and the crown of thorns and dressed, in that fake regalia that Pilate prescribed for him. Extreme humility. He patiently and humbly accepts that humiliation. Again, patristic theologians talk about something which is called kenosis. Kenosis is a Greek word that means emptying. It's emptying. They speak of the Son of God having to humble himself to such a degree in his personhood so as not to destroy the humanity that he was taking on board into his hypostasis, into his personhood. Because his personhood is not human, it is divine. It is the personhood of the Son of God. Right? But to make this merger of this union of two natures in one person, he had to limit himself, empty himself, as it were, to such a degree. And the Holy Fathers also say, well, in actual fact, he did what is natural for God to do, because that's what God does all the time. Because they explain that the Father constantly prefers the Son and the Holy Spirit. The Son prefers the Father and the Holy Spirit to himself. And the Holy Spirit does the same. So it's a continuous sort of circular movement of humility and love. Love is not possible without this self-emptying. And it applies to human relations as well. But of course, Christ does it in a much greater scale than is possible for us human beings. Why, again, is humility so important? Well, as far back as the book of Proverbs, it is said, God resists the proud and gives his grace to the humble. And St. James, the brother of the Lord, first Bishop of Jerusalem, whose letter Martin Luther didn't like at all, because he spoke about faith needing to be manifest in works. So it's not salvation by any old faith. St. James quotes those exact words in his letter. It's very important. Pride is the main problem of humanity. It's the central problem. Okay? Pride is what happened when we fell. We fell away from God. We attempted to achieve autonomy from God. Okay? But it's impossible, because our being comes from God. Our being is something that needs to be constantly fed by the being, the one who is I am, Him, the one who said I am to Moses at the burning bush. So we can't imagine that we can break away from God and be autonomous of Him. We can break away, but He doesn't abandon us. Because if He did, we would cease to exist. This is what we need to think about. And pride in this attempted autonomy is, of course, arrogance and haughtiness and bullying, right? And wanting to be the boss. Remember this two very powerful stories from the Gospel. Firstly, the Gospel, the story how as Christ with His 12 disciples is going on His last journey from the north to the south, to Judea, from Galilee to Judea. Two of His disciples, two sons of Zebedee, James and John, come up to Him and say, Master, if it's possible, could we have those two spots? Could we sit on the right and the left hand of You when You come into Your glory, when You become the King of Israel? And He said, you don't know what you're talking about. Can you drink the cup that I am drinking? He explains to them and to the disciples, to all the disciples, that His thinking is different. He reverses the perception of fallen man, that to be the boss, to be the one whose will is projected, is sort of kept by other people, who forces other people to obey him or her, that this is good. It was part of the ancient culture. I talk to my parishioners about magisterium and ministerium, Latin words. Now, everyone who is proud, who is fallen, and that's all of us, even secretly inside, we want to be the boss. And Christ said, I have come not to be served, but to serve. And to illustrate that, a few days later, before they sit down for the Passover meal, at which He introduces them to the sacrament of His body and blood, and explains that this is the New Testament in His blood. He washes their feet. The washing of feet was done by servants. in the Middle East. When someone received a guest, the guest was given the honor in a wealthy household that the servants would wash his or her feet. Christ gets a towel and a pitcher and a jug of water and a basin and goes around and washes all of their feet to teach them about humility. Right. Humility is the foundation of love. It is indeed. Now, I mentioned Father Sophrony Sakharov, a disciple of Saint Silouan of the Holy Mountain. Father Sophrony founded a monastic, an unusual community. It was monastic and also a monastic community and a parish as well in Essex, in England. And on one occasion, he used to give talks after services. On one occasion, he asked his parishioners and his monastics, he says, "What is the greatest commandment?" They looked around and, as if to say, "Well, Father, why are you asking that question? Didn't Christ already explain that it's the commandment of love that is the greatest commandment in the law? To love God and to love your neighbor." He says, "Yes, of course, won't argue about that. But there's something else that is even more important." And they said, "What is this?" And he said, well, and this is, for instance, in Luke chapter 17, verse 10. "When you have done all those things which you are commanded, say, we are unprofitable, unworthy servants. We have done what was our duty to do." So even when we keep the commandment of love, even when we love our enemies, we have to protect ourselves from the root of pride, which is almost impossible to destroy until we die. Even very few of the saints manage to do it in this life before their death. Because this is the remnant of our fallen nature, our attempt at this autonomy. We have to humble ourselves and say, well, whatever I've done, I was only supposed to do it. All right, so it's very, very important to understand. And the Orthodox, the culture of orthodoxy, the culture of the Holy Fathers and the Holy Mothers. Look at some of the lives of the Holy Mothers. Wow. They constantly teach about humility, because without humility, without humbling yourself, you're not tuned to God. You're not in God's channel. You have not opened your heart to the grace of God. You are unable to love in a divine way. You are only able to love in a possessive way, in a consuming way, if you don't have humility. And here I think I need to stop because, well, I've gone over my time, I think, and I can't drag on too long because we've got another talk. We've got Helen sitting here. All right. Mm-hmm.
Questions?
Yeah, if there's
You've got time for some questions? There are a few. They're all basically, I think, revolving around the same thing and I think they're basically struggling with what the definition of this love that we're talking about. So one question is, what is the difference between loving, forgiving someone compared to disciplining or punishing them?
what is the difference between loving and forgiving
Yeah.
and disciplining?
Yeah.
Well, look, maybe there's no difference. Maybe, sometimes love, and I'm sure that Helen might mention this as well, that we need tough love as well. And yes, what I perhaps need to delineate here is that we human beings in our fallen nature want to perceive God as Santa Claus. Whatever we do, God says, she'll be right. Good boy, good girl, doesn't matter. Yeah, okay, good. So, okay, that's what we want. And that's not God's idea of love, because He perceives us. Not He perceives us, this is how He's created us. He wants us to be eternal beings. And to reach that, to go beyond the naked ape, as I said today, is to accept chastisement sometimes. That's it. No pain, no gain. Do you think that sort of answers the question?
Yep. Okay, so the other one is around this, how to love your enemy. How can you love your enemy? So how can you love the insert whoever the enemy? It could be a enemy of your faith, or it could be the enemy of your community that you're living in, who may seek to undermine your efforts and want to propagate their own faith or their own political beliefs or
Well, the best story I can tell you here to illustrate this is the story of Constantine the philosopher, who became, I hope I haven't told the story earlier on in our series, because I talk to a lot of people and sometimes, I might repeat things. He became later with his brother, Saints Kirill and Methodius, the enlighteners of the Slavs. But Constantine the philosopher was sent at the request of the Arab Khalif to discuss Christian faith, matters of faith with Islamic muftis, imams. And they asked him, your Christ tells you to love enemies. Why do you fight us? Fight us, Muslims. He asked them, if a religion has two commandments, should I keep one or both of them? And they said, we would think that you'd need to keep both of them. Well, he said, in fact, Christ gave another commandment, not only about loving your enemies, but he said, there is no greater love than to lay down your life for your loved ones. So he said, we love you all individually, even though you're our enemies, right? We love you. But when you gang up on us, and specifically on our women and children, and our weak ones, and want to convert us by force and do things that we disagree with, well, then we pick up our arms and we go out into the field and we are prepared to lay down our lives in defense of our loved ones. Okay? So he illustrated that, this commandment of loving enemies doesn't mean that you should that you shouldn't have any protective kind of lines in the sand. Well, that's very important. Sometimes people think that if you're a Christian, you have to put up with everything. Well, no, that's not quite right. Okay? Number one, you might be weak yourself. And so you need to draw the line, because you cannot make greater sacrifices than you can do with peace and love. Because otherwise you'll have resentment. You'll feel hurt. Yeah. So that's what it's about. But how is it possible to love your enemies? Well, as I said, it's impossible just through human effort or attempt. It has to happen through prayer and opening up to the grace of God and growing in grace. Yes, then it becomes possible. And as we grow, we are able to have more and more patience, more and more humility. Okay? But when we start off, we don't have all that much, and we have to protect ourselves. All right? Yes. As a matter of fact, the modern experience, where Christians and Muslims perceive each other as kind of enemies like that, is, well, there were periods in the early history when the relations were quite good. And as a matter of fact, one of the bishops from Russia who visited us here a couple of days ago, or just yesterday, he sent me a clip where they're building. There was a ceremony where they're building a church and a mosque in a government colony for convicts, basically it's like a prison. It's like a working, yeah. So because this is in Bashkiria, they call it Bashkortostan or something like that now. There's lots of Muslims there, but the Christians and the Muslims actually live very peacefully together there, very peaceful. And this was the experience, for instance, in Bosnia before the war. Christians and Muslims lived very well together. It's possible.
All right. I think we're ready for Dr. Helen. Sticks and carrots. Carrots and sticks.
So I guess I might be, Father Nick actually asked me to touch on love and some examples of what love is, and I guess from a secular perspective, and maybe perhaps to answer the question that person had, what is love? Which is something that the world over as human beings, I guess we seek and we want to have in our life. And interestingly, there's different forms of love. So what we, I suppose, have between family members or between friends or between partners, it all varies. So I guess the first kind of love is what the ancient Greeks spoke about as in terms of agape, which is unconditional love, or God love for God, which is, altruistic, selfless, unconditional. So it's kind of like, as Father Nick was saying, just more like from Christ. Whereas for us as I suppose as people, what we tend to think of as love is that romantic eros, the romantic love. So more the passionate, the physical love. It's an expression of desire. But we also have what we know as philia as well, which is affectionate love. So it's the kind of love that you feel for your friends, really. So what we know, some people might know as platonic love. And it's interesting because this is a love that's typically viewed between two equals. Now, I don't know if that's always said for every relationship, but it's in terms of platonic, they actually see themselves as two equals. Now, there's also, and I can't pronounce it, but it's actually meant to be philatia. Philatia? Philatia. Philatia. Philautia. Self-love, I guess, is the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for self-love, that might sound really odd, but from a secular perspective, most people associate self-love with being narcissistic or being selfish or stuck up on themselves. But self-love from a secular perspective is not negative or unhealthy in any way, but from a secular perspective, we see it as being important in being able to give and to receive love from other people. So because some of the people that I see, it's easy to give love, but it's very difficult for them to receive. Or perhaps they're able to receive, but they're unable to give. So just have a think about that for a moment. Because we can't give to others what we actually don't have, or we don't experience, or have never have experienced. And if we don't love ourselves, how can we truly love others? So another way to look at self-love is thinking about it as self-compassion. So just as you might show affection and love to another person, you almost show that same affection and love to yourself. And I guess from where I'm coming from that is particularly from a psychologist's perspective with trauma, the clients that I see, it's very difficult for them to actually have any self-compassion, to have the ability to forgive themselves, to actually care for themselves, and in that struggle to actually have relationships, because how can they give to others what they can't give to themselves? Another one is actually what we call storge, so familiar love. So storge can be defined as, I guess, the love similar to philia, which is between family. So parents to children, uncles, aunties, that extended kin. So knowing that you are from someone's family, knowing that you belong to that group. So it's parent and child, but it also extended, so it's a bond, it's kinship, yeah? And familiarity between people, knowing that you're part of something. And then there's pragma, which is number 6, so enduring love. Now, this is almost the opposite of eros. This is the love that I suppose people, hope to have or would like to have. And it's eros, which is a romantic love. That passionate love tends to burn out pretty quickly early in a relationship. But what enduring love is really more sort of, in terms of pragma, is more love between two people that mature. So that old couple of nearly 80 years old that are still holding hands with each other, that have been married since their teenage years. So this is a love that is rare in today's society, in the sense that people hurry up to, the grass is greener on the other side. They don't want to learn with each other. They don't want to grow with each other. They don't want to wait and tolerate the growing pain of a relationship, if you like, sometimes. Because to be in a relationship, in a marriage, really takes time, but also needing patience, and to have the desire to watch that love grow over time. So love doesn't actually stay, from a secular perspective, love doesn't stay the same within a relationship or within a person. It grows over time, and I guess people need to be able to make compromises, but also are willing and are good at making compromises, but also too that each of the person puts equal efforts to make the other person happy. It can't be a one-sided relationship. If it's one-sided, then that's not quite the partnership that one anticipates. Number 7 is ludos, which is playful love. I guess it's really a better way to explain it is like the infatuation. So the infatuation, the early stage of a relationship. It's the butterflies in the stomach, it's when the phone call rings or you're hearing the knock on the door and it's kind of that giddiness. And interestingly, research shows us that, that kind of love is your brain lights up the same way as you would if you were taking cocaine. So it's kind of like, it feels good. And it's so exciting, which is why everyone wants that, those initial stages of a relationship. It feels fabulous. So it's kind of like, it makes you feel alive. It makes you feel excited about life. The next one we have is mania, or obsessive love. This is not a very healthy kind of love at all, obviously, because it's obsessive. But this kind of love can lead someone into madness. And madness, jealousy, anger, and it's off because there's no balance in the relationship. Yeah? So that isn't a relationship that you really want to be in. If there's a partner that says, spends all their time on, focuses on you, doesn't let you see anyone else, doesn't let you go out anywhere else, doesn't let you, is very controlling, and you might think, oh, isn't that marvellous? They're totally focused on me. And it's like, yes, no, I wouldn't say that's a good thing. There needs to be balance. There needs to be balance. So just to think of, hang on a second, is my love an obsessive kind of love? Now, real love, that's a big one, isn't it? So real love is when two or more people come together with open hearts that are already filled with love. Yeah? So, and the love from their heart overflows and it's just shared openly and joyously. So, if you come to a relationship with feelings of emptiness or unworthiness, it's very difficult then to express that love to another, to genuinely convey love to the other. Yeah? You can't experience real love first needing to heal the wound of that unworthiness and that sense of emptiness before being able to give. And then in terms of what's the deepest form of love is mystica, so mystical union. So in Christianity, which probably the final stage of the spiritual path, and other religions will use other terms, but it's the union, I suppose, with God, I suppose. So that's the different kinds of love. Now, as you sit and reflect and, what is love? What have I got in my life? What do I see as love? What do I experience as love? Or can I connect? Can I identify with what love is? And for others, and I haven't included it, but it's also, I guess for some people, love with their pets. Because some people actually can't feel and connect to love with another human being, but can with an animal. So that's for a lot of people that are unable to bond and yet place their love elsewhere. Yeah? So as in terms, the carrot and the stick, that was something to give me to think about, really. So in terms of drivers of human behaviour, what drives us? And Aristotle said, man is by nature a social animal. So obviously we're wanting to be in relationship. And from a neurophysiological perspective, our brain is actually wired to connect. So we aren't meant to live alone. And what that means and what we understand with that is we're social creatures. Social being, we need the company of others to have a sense of identity, a sense of connection, a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose with which we can actually build our life. Now, human behaviour, it's varied. There's a school of thought called applied behaviour analysis, and in that theory, a human being can be the most intellectually disabled and challenged, yet will still be able to communicate their needs if we know what to look for. And that's where people trained in ABA do a lot of the work. And what happens is, in those situations, at the very core, at a very fundamental, we either
want something, yeah, positive or negative, or we want to avoid something, positive or negative. They're the two drivers. So rewards and punishment, yeah. But that's an extrinsic, that's external, that's in the environment, okay? So there's also internal drivers. So I guess looking from human self-determination theory, which is from the humanistic model, there's a couple of drivers that are internal, which means what are we looking for in life? What do we want out of life? So what we're actually wanting is the need for a sense of significance. Yeah? So I guess, and this is what Father Nick was talking about earlier, for us it's achieved through the perceived sense of control over our life. That's the autonomy, which I'll touch on and Father Nick touched on, but it's that sense of autonomy that we have control over our life. Yeah. The other one is a sense of social belonging, which, as you said, you know, that why, the connection, needing to be in a pack, needing to connect and talk to each other. And then the other one is a sense of effective social contribution. So what are we doing with our lives? Do we work? Do we communicate? Do we have family? Do we work? We all want to feel significant. Like we all belong, like we make a contribution. So when this is achieved, we feel fulfilled. When it's not achieved, we feel the need to compensate for a lack of, hang on a second, there's something missing. I don't know what it is, but just something a little bit off, yeah? So according to self-determination theory, there's three underlying human needs. So besides of Maslow, so these needs, which are, you know, shelter, safety, food, all the rest of it, that triangle, but there's three needs that are universal. So it doesn't matter what culture, what religion, it doesn't matter where you are, it's innate, they're universal, and they're psychological. And that's the autonomy, which that sense that we need to be able to make free decisions with our life. That sense of freedom that we can choose what we do, where we go. Relatedness, that refers to the idea that we have a level of freedom and being able to do what we want. So individuality. We still need to feel connected, though, to something bigger than ourselves. But it could be for a lot of people that's also sometimes too just a sense of community. Maybe it's not religion, maybe it's not spirituality, maybe it's just community. And then competence is that sense that we're able to develop a skill or mastery, allowing us to actually feel as though we're contributing. So for people, for all of us, it's typically getting a job, getting an education or a job of some description to enable us to work, to enable us to be able to make choices for our life, to enable to pay its bills, eventually provide for a family if that's what's chosen, or to provide for ourselves. And what those skills too are not just individually, but also too for the greater good. So in terms of others that maybe are altruistic in their community, or the skills that they learn and wanting to help others. So there's multiple ways to look at it. Now, what happens when those needs aren't met? Now, that basically comes down to when our personal significance is threatened, who we are as people, who we are as individuals, we feel threatened. So when we feel threatened, whether it be our sense of safety, whether we be our sense of who we are as an individual, it goes to a very rudimentary place in the brain, and it just hits off that fight, flight, freeze response system. So it doesn't even, having a fight with your boss at work. It's like, well, hang on a second, maybe I'm not good enough at my job. Maybe I'm going to get sacked. What does that mean for me? Maybe I'm not performing as well. So all these things start to come of, hang on a second, maybe I'm not as competent, or I don't have free choice, and there's various environmental factors that impact on how you feel and how you interpret yourself and how you interpret yourself in the world. Now, to restore sort of that fight, flight, and that loss of significance that we feel maybe we've lost with those drivers, that we're not competent or not as competent as we should be, or maybe that, you know, we don't have as much freedom as we thought we did, or maybe we actually, you know what, we actually don't have that much free choice in our life after all, that we work 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, maybe 6-7 days a week. You know, what we thought we could choose isn't really a reality. So then that starts to play on us in a way that shows up in our behaviour. And it shows up in a way that disrupts our ability to connect to people, and it disrupts our ability to connect to others in the capacity of love. A fight response might includes, or could include, and what I mean a fight response, which tends to suggest that, hang on a second, we're challenged. And when we're challenged, we might need to fight our way out of it to show that we are indeed actually good enough. So that might be a sign of superiority, or power, or it's not a place of being. It's not a place of being true to oneself. Yeah, it's not a place of being centered or compassionate. It's a place of being under threat. Now, superiority probably includes also sabotaging others, or aggressive attempts to control others, or attempts to control or manipulate others. Now, this could be said for any relationship, any situation, any place, any time. It doesn't need to be between two spouses. It can be between children. It can be at work. It can be at home. It can be in a shopping centre. These are all situations that are just can be applied anywhere. A flight response, which means we want to withdraw, or we run away. Yeah. We don't like what we're feeling, or we don't like what's happening, and so we want to get away from that. And the way we do that, and this is unconscious, and so is the fight response. They're both unconscious, so we engage in behaviours that we're not actually conscious and aware of what we're doing. But what our brain is telling us is, this feels terrible. I need this terrible feeling to stop. How can I make it stop? This is what I'm going to do. A fight response could include escapist behaviours, so social withdrawal. It could be the use of drugs, other addictive behaviours, and ineffective coping mechanisms as well. But they also fuel other addiction and mental health issues. And then the freeze response, again, is when we're just overwhelmed and we disconnect. And typically that can also be seen as depression. We just can't cope, we can't do anything, so we just withdraw internally and disconnect, whether it be from family, friends, or the outside world. No questions? Not yet?
Yeah, come in, there's questions.
Yeah. Happy to take one.
Helen, you mentioned a lot of different types of love. What if we don't know which type of love we fall into?
And this is the thing. I mean, is it just one type of love that we fall into? And this is where awareness comes in, I think, and self-reflection, and us pausing to contemplate where actually are we? Because so often in life, and me included, you know, we're so busy with working or family commitments, and it's just day in, day out. You get up, you have breakfast, you go to work, you come home, and it's just there's not a lot of time for reflection. So really to sit down when there's some time to yourself or with someone that you trust, and actually reflect, hang on, where am I?
because the types of love also too aren't very obvious when we're in them. And maybe the infatuation might be, because that's clearly an easy one to see. But as in terms of the others, I think it's sometimes a bit trickier, particularly if you might be in a manic or an obsessive one, and you think, oh, this is fabulous. No one's ever shown me any attention before in my life. And then all of a sudden, it's just all about you, and you are the centre of someone's attention. That would feel really great for a period of time, and then it would become suffocating. But then you'd be in that pattern and stuck and you wouldn't realise it. So it's quite difficult to say where you are. Obviously the ideal, there's ideals there, but we all struggle to achieve it. So that's where I think is in terms of faith, and then potential therapy comes into play to sit and be able to reflect where indeed, or if it is causing issues. But definitely awareness, we all need awareness to reflect on where are we and what are we doing.
I think we probably also, you might fluctuate between different types of, different types of love
Absolutely.
as time goes on.
And you mentioned that a relationship, any relationship has to be maintained and develops, right? That's pretty important, isn't it?
It's very important. I think it's easy for us to not attend to it.
Yes.
When we finish off, I'd like to share a story about that from one of our bishops, which I thought was a really beautiful interpretation of a part of our wedding service. Okay, but let's get back to what you were saying. Yes, that was very interesting how you listed all sorts of different types of love as defined. Well, traditionally in the secular world.
There's different kinds, but I think also too, it's to say is there. I think we can fall into a trap of saying, this is the explanation in this theory, this is the explanation in this theory, this is the explanation. There are so many theories abounding in psychology. That's the reason that it's all driven by theory. It's all driven by research, and people hypothesize. And I guess it's just important to kind of just sit and reflect and take stock of what it means for you. We needn't fit a particular category, or we needn't fit a particular label, or we needn't say, well, which one am I? And it's like, well, why should you be one in particular? Are we that, sort of stagnant or rigid in our personality or our being? We're fluid. So we're fluid in our thoughts, we're fluid in our emotions, we're fluid in our beliefs, probably not so much. And they can become a little bit rigid over time, so depending on what we've brought up with, beliefs and thoughts tend to be longer term and longer lasting. But there is a possibility for change. But I was also just going to touch on that for the psychodynamic theory, there's defence mechanisms too if we don't have, if our needs are unmet. So, which is probably also the typical one that, we, as humans, sometimes people might displace their anger or their, they're acting out a substitute. For example, you've got a bad day. You've had a bad day at the office and you come home and you take it out on your partner. It's like, hang on a second, I'm cooking dinner. But it's a safe place to take, there's nothing wrong with your partner. But you've had a really bad day at the office and you weren't going to take it out on your boss. Let's say you come home to a safe space and take it out there, yeah?
How effective is a punching bag?
Punching bags are actually really good. I highly recommend them.
Yeah? You recommend
I
them?
do. It's a fight-flight response where you actually express an actual punching bag, yeah.
You can get human torso ones as well.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't recommend that. There's the line.
Could I ask you a question about personal space in a relationship? How important that is?
I think it's very important. I think we need to realise that we're two different people coming together to complement each other, not to fill the other's needs, not to rescue the other, not to, again, from a secular perspective. Because so often relationships are like, oh, well, you know, I can fix him. He'll change if he loves me. You know, that expectation of, oh no, I'm just going to mould him into exactly everything that I dream a perfect guy could be. I didn't start with a perfect guy, but by the time I finish, he'll be perfect. So to realise that, hang on a second, what are you needing that you're trying to get him to give you? So rather than expecting, and this is from, again, working from a trauma perspective, so often we have people that feel aggrieved because, you know, wanting retribution or wanting an apology, or not even an apology, because there's so much anger and hurt, but rather to say, okay, what is it that you didn't get? So whatever time period of your life, whether as a child, whether as an infant, whether as an adult, to say, okay, well, Mum never loved me, Dad never listened, my auntie just never, always invalidated me, my brother never said I was good enough. And there's a school of thought called internal family systems where we look at all of those parts over the years that have been troubled to say, okay, well, they missed out on whatever it was that they missed out, that they still grieve that loss. To say, hang on a second, well, as an adult now, what can you give that part that missed out? So whether it was that validation, whether it was that acceptance, whether it was that love, whether it was that forgiveness, whether it was to say, if you give that to yourself, not looking for it from a partner, and then come into a relationship whole, then coming whole, and you come together, and then you create and go on, ideally, from a secular perspective. But that's where, can I just say, I'll put a.
Well, relationships are never perfect, but there's always a growth.
You should always be growing. You should always be growing, because you can't stay the same as a 20-year-old. I'm not the same person I was now as a not 20-year-old. There is growth in human development, as there is in any other. We age physically. Why don't we age emotionally, mentally? How do we stay stagnant? We can't.
But often it's those things like the growth is spurred on, I think, because of they're initiated by something else that's happened, whether it's like having children or buying a dog, or or like your parents dying, or these kinds of things.
Yeah,
I mean, if things don't change, then it's very hard for a couple or a person even by himself to kind of develop, or if there's no reason to. I mean, you would never really change.
Well, sometimes if you're too insular, and the way I say it is sometimes you might be too in your head. To say, hang on a second, and we might be fixated on certain points of loss in our life that will just ruminate about that loss. But the idea is every relationship or every human being will be faced with challenges in life. And I tend to say, life is suffering, and people say, are you Buddhist? It's like, no, I'm not actually Buddhist, but, life is suffering. And that's, people come into the therapy expecting, oh, well, I just want to be happy. And it's like, well, happiness is a bit of an illusion. And again, are you Buddhist? It's like, well, no, but happiness is, you can have moments of happiness, but, are we, and I think that's an expectation from society that somehow everybody else is happy.
all of the time, constantly, and it's just us that's not.
Have you checked Instagram?
It's an illusion.
American Constitution, pursuit of happiness.
But that's exactly how it's like.
But the pursuit of happiness is one thing. I mean, it's very, from a creative point of view.
Yeah.
I mean, writers or artists, your happiest times can be, you know, struggling and occurring during failure and struggle and nervousness and kind of all these kind of other emotions. That could be your like happiest times.
But how many songs do you hear that? I mean, there's some happy songs, a lot of happy songs, obviously, but also to some, you know, absolute chart toppers that are woefully, you know, sad and depressing, yet popular because they speak to people. And it's like they're singing to me, just me. It's like,
Yeah.
so it's like, okay, that's a universal feeling. Yeah.
Can I just one thing that I was thinking about, Father Nick, you might want to comment on this as well. But what about our perceptions of love through history? I mean, and that kind of relates to relationships. How relationship was seen, like between a parent and his child, was totally different 200 years ago to what it is now, or a parent and a husband and wife, or wife and husband, or even like the populace to their leaders, kind of thing. Like we don't have a monarchy in Australia, so probably for people like me, it's a strange feeling that you would, you know, love the leader or love the Prime Minister, as well as, you know, like the parent-child relationship has changed over history, as does the spousal relationships. Do you think there are some positives and some negatives happening, or is it becoming more difficult in some ways, or?
That's such a big question.
Just thought I'd drop that one in there. In 15 words or less.
I guess I can only speak from what I see in my rooms. I mean, obviously that's where I'll come from, because that's what I can speak to. And I think, and what I see, really, we're talking adults that range up until their late 60s. I've got the whole range of age that interestingly comes down more or less to parents and or family of origin, not necessarily parents. It could also be grandparents that, you know, for some way or another, for some people there might be rays of hope in relationships, but for the vast majority that come across in my rooms, it's been very difficult and it's been very traumatic. I'd like to say things have changed in the sense that, you know, we are managing to see a child these days and to hear a child and to validate a child and to normalise their fear, to normalise their sadness, to identify it for them, because that's how they learn. We label their emotions for them, and we teach them how to manage it, and we teach them how to regulate. And the way we do that is we model it, and that's what we call co-regulation. So when we actually blow our top and we're cooking dinner, we've had a bad day at work, and then the youngest comes in and has a meltdown, and we have a meltdown because they're having a meltdown and we're screaming at them. That's not co-regulation. That's us showing them how to lose the plot. Yeah, and yet we're disappointed when they can't control their emotions. Well, because we haven't showed them how to control our emotions. So, you know, for us to do as parents is to say, I think we're getting better. I think there's more awareness now of the impact of family. But having said that, I think domestic violence isn't what We're now labelling it as domestic violence, whereas previously in generations gone past, it's just the way you did it.
Mm.
You know, it's just the way we raised, you know, I can remember copying a flogging. It's like, oh, yes. But there's also cultural differences now. You know, I mean, you wouldn't, you know, children, if you touch me, I'm going to call the police.
Yeah.
It's assault. And it's legitimately assault. But culturally, if you've got grandparents and that say, well, you know what, deserves a good spanking. And they don't understand. So things have shifted. But also too, just seeing that things haven't shifted enough, where there is still a lot of issues in households that even in ISO today, with the numbers that we're seeing and the statistics that we're seeing, there's still a lot of issues that with domestic violence, that things aren't quite healthy and can be much, much, much better than what they are.
Story time?
Story time? Okay, well, the story goes back to probably mid to late 70s, and it was one of our youth conferences, and our bishop at that time, a very respected and elderly gentleman, Archbishop Theodosi, he sat there patiently listening to a talk on marriage given by one of the youth, who of course had no experience in marriage at all. So it was all theory. So he sat there patiently and humbly. Afterwards he said, well, if you don't mind, I'd just like to add a little bit to what was said by the speaker. And he said, look, I'd just like to comment on one of the last parts of the Orthodox marriage ceremony, and that's when the priest takes the couple in a round procession. That's in honor of the Holy Trinity, of course, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Fine. He says, I'd like to share with you my thoughts about what each one of those circuits means. He says, I think they speak about a development of the relationship in the marriage. He says, because during the first circuit, the choir sings the first of the hymns, which begins with the words, Isaiah rejoice. So this is stage one. And almost every marriage has a good stage one. The rocket takes off. Zoom. All right? There's a lot of that, obviously, what you were talking about, Helen, eros there that makes it happen typically. It's the honeymoon, right? It's the honeymoon part of the marriage. Things are easy because, well, there are lots of God-given energies to make it happen in the first stage. But he said, first stage is joyful. It's not very deep. Not very deep, like emotionally or spiritually. He says, after a while, stage two comes along. All right? And in the wedding ceremony, the hymn there begins with the words, O holy martyrs. Right? So, yes, he said, it's a testing time, stage two, because after the party's over in stage one, the couple realize, wow, there's responsibility, there's work to do. My gosh, how are we going to do it? And trials and tribulations begin. But he said, in fact, this is the most creative and interesting part of the marriage. It's just that a lot of people don't know how to handle it. That's the problem. because they have no idea what they're supposed to be doing in that stage, right? And no principle, you know, whether spiritual or ethical, whatever, anything. So, you know, it becomes a tug of war often. Right, but he said in a Christian marriage, it is truly a creative stage. This is when, and I thought to myself, sitting there, you know, being sort of musically inclined, I thought, oh, it's ABA, sonata form, that's what it is. It's a development of a theme. Okay, the theme is introduced in stage 1, developed in B, and then comes back to A. And that's what he basically said, because he said the third circuit begins with the words, "Glory to thee, O Christ God." So it's, you know, saying thank you to God for a successful marriage and for a proper development, you know, after the takeoff, you know, and growth, so that the autumn of a couple's life is a joyful one, but it's a quiet joy, but it's like a good mature wine. That's what it's like. So it's not, you know, the bubbly at the beginning. No. Yes, there's a psychological and spiritual development, there's an understanding, and it's not like, I believe some say that when couples are young, they argue because they don't know each other. When they're old, they argue because they know each other too much. Well, it shouldn't be like that. So I thought, well, it's a really good model, a really good explanation of that part of the service, the wedding service, and so it made it so meaningful for me when I was young myself.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point to finish, I think.
Yes, I think so, and I think that we can now say goodbye.
Are you going to read a
I'll say
prayer?
I'll say a prayer. Yes, just.
So we'll be back in a fortnight's time.
Yes. Helen, thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. All right. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure Mother, our God, more honourable than the cherubim, beyond compare, more glorious than the seraphim. Without corruption, thou gavest birth to God, the Word, true Theotokos, we do magnify. Thank you all. Good night. All right, bravo.